Brilliant. So I'd like to introduce my guest for today's podcast, Vincent Teyssier, who is partner for digital transformation and also the ProcureTech practices at Devolut. Vincent, thank you very much for joining me. How are you?
I'm great. Saturday, Friday afternoon in Singapore, always a good time to record some podcasts with you.
Yeah, and looking forward to some relaxing Friday evening entertainment and socializing afterwards, I assume.
Oh, definitely opening a bottle of wine after that.
Excellent stuff. Good to hear it. Cool. So we're here to talk today about some topics around digital transformation and ProcureTech. I've seen you on podcasts before. I've seen some of your content. I really enjoy the stuff you put out there. You've got some quite strong points of view and a real kind of unique approach in the way that you talk about some of this stuff. So I'm really looking forward to digging in some of these topics with you today.
Sure.
Just in terms of a bit of background, you're clearly very passionate about procurement. And I know you've kind of talked to me about how it's such an incredible function for learning business. How did it all start for you, and how did you end up doing what you're doing now?
Yeah, first of all, I'm absolutely not a procurement person. I'm a technology person. I code since I'm 10 years old. I was working in marketing technologies before moving to procurement. And initially, I got an offer to move to procurement in Singapore. I was very excited by the move, much less by the function. When you're in marketing, you look at it as a non-sexy function, as boring, to be honest. But then I arrived in Singapore. Yes, it's full of process, it's full of compliance, and people are not especially joyful, but ultimately it's a mindset. It's up to you to make it fun for yourself and to dig into it. And the more I was digging into it, the more I understood that it's a function that touches all the other departments in your company. You work with IT, you work with finance, you work with marketing, sales, all the different functions, whether it's through digitalization programs to help the users to order whatever they need to order, but also on some high projects. I was in Telenor, which is a telecommunication company, and there we were sourcing multi-billion contracts, which definitely touch a big part, not only of the organization, but also of the top management. So very quickly, it became extremely interested to be exposed to so many different processes within the company, but also to be exposed to top management. You don't get that anywhere else. This is really the only one which touches everything. And for me, what makes something very interesting is the diversity of things you're doing. Let's say that today I'm looking at compliance through approval chain settings. Tomorrow I'm going to look maybe at improving the efficiency of the e-auction module, or I'm going to look at creating adoption for the purchasing requests. Or I'm going to look at benchmarking, performance management. It's extremely diverse what you can do in it. Also, you're not centered internally. Procurement is half internal in demand management, in stakeholder management, and project planning, but it's also half external, supplier relationship management. When you tender to the market, when you do market analysis and gather benchmark data from external sources. It's really not as it sounds from the external. It's a very sexy function, actually. It's a lot of process re-engineering, it's a lot of digitalization efforts, and it's a lot of common sense. I think probably 80% of procurement is common sense. Of course, you need the experience, you need a bit of knowledge, but common sense will get you very far away immediately. Yeah.
And as you kind of came through the different things that you've done, how important has it been for you in terms of kind of building your network out and expanding your reach in the way that you have done, coming through to what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I think that it forces you definitely to go outside of your shell. In procurement, you do not spend all your day crunching numbers or writing emails. You need to meet people. You need to create a relationship. People need to trust you to understand the values that you provide. So definitely going out, meeting people, establishing relationship is a big part of the work, I would say. I think we're going to talk about transition to consulting a bit later. So that's a big part of it. But I think that also one thing which is very important, and I see the major vendors in the procurement space insisting on the community aspect of it, because when you're too focused internally, you tend to miss actually a lot of improvement opportunities. And suddenly you're going at a conference from a vendor, or you're going to meet other customers from a vendor that you're using, and these guys have the same challenges as you, but maybe they solve them very differently. And exchanging is a huge part of bringing new ideas to the business. I was talking about performance management recently and benchmarking. And when you benchmark, you look at the leader score. One of the traditional pitfalls is that you just try to copy the leaders. And copying instead of innovating is not going to bring you very far. The reason the leaders are the leaders is because they were centering their views on their problem and they solved them by being creative. If you just copy a recipe that works, yes, it's going to be bringing improvements, of course, but you're going to plateau at some point. It's really about understanding the big picture, the specifics of your industry, of your organization, and of your landscape. By looking at it and being creative, that you can really aspire to become a leader in whatever you're trying to achieve for. So yeah, this community aspect for me is essential in procurement, and it's really, really developed, probably even more than in most of the other functions.
Yeah, and obviously that's kind of the reason why we're having this conversation, isn't it? To get the dialogue going, to put stuff out there. A couple of really interesting points you brought up there, I just want to have a look at. Procurement is in a quite a unique position in the way that it touches so many different functions within an organization. But I think it's also in a very interesting position in the sense that it has access to and is a kind of a fulcrum for a lot of different data sets and data points. And one of those is the internal versus external balance that you talked about. I find that particularly fascinating. As you said, we can talk in a minute about your crossover to the consulting world from kind of practice in-house. But that's quite a unique viewpoint, really, isn't it? To be able to see what's happening within the organization and how the organization views their external kind of suppliers, which if it's delivering goods, that's fundamental to their business. If they're delivering services, they're almost like extended capacity of the organization. But to get a view of what's happening internally and what the internal stakeholders think of the external suppliers, supply chain, and the other way round, I think that's a really unique viewpoint. Just being able to see, well, we don't want to operate in a vacuum. As a business, what are other organizations that are doing clever, cool stuff? What do they think of what we're doing? And like you say, that kind of innovation and creativity, that's the sexy part of it, really, isn't it?
Yeah. So whether you're a procurement category manager, category director, or you're a process center of excellence, your goal is to be data driven. You need to have all the data. So when you start to build a performance management framework, you start with basic KPIs, and you see deviations from these KPIs. The same when you gather data from external benchmark and from internal sources, and you compare them. You start with the basics, and then you start to find opportunities of improvement or opportunities in the market. But very quickly, you will reach a limit because you don't necessarily know what is the business process behind the data. So you need to dig constantly to try to explain what is happening behind it. For example, I remember we're implementing some processes, and we look at the ledgers. And we see some reversal transactions, and we're absolutely not understanding what was happening. That was skewing one KPI, so we had to go to the bottom of it. And we understood that it was substitution, that you receive a product without a purpose for it. And then 6 months later, when you sell it, in telco you have prepaid and postpaid. You suddenly assign it a purpose, and this purpose has a very different financial meaning, whether it's prepaid and postpaid. So you had a kind of reversal, then rebooking of the same transaction. That's an example of how deep you can dig into the data and really understand what is the business process behind. I discovered processes I had no idea were existing. Consignment, substitution items, exchange rate variance. When you look at accounting in Europe, exchange rate variance, you ask, most of the people don't really know what it is. But in Southeast Asia, where you have a lot of variance in the currency, the impact on the P&L is actually enormous. So they book it, and they're very, very rigorous in calculating it. So yeah, it's just, you look at the data, you need to dig, you need to find what is the root cause, what is the root process behind it. And I find this really captivating. I'm coding since I'm 10 years old, and that's what I always loved when I was coding, is that you need to find what's wrong in your code, right? You need to dig, you need to grind, kind of. And that's exactly what procurement gives you. It gives you the opportunity to understand so many processes in very deep details and to improve efficiency one process at a time.
Yeah, that is quite like coding, really, isn't it? In terms of the creativity of seeing an overall architecture, a developer being able to see an overall architecture in their head of where they want to get to, what fits where, how you can add new processes in without destroying old processes, without making the whole thing totally inefficient. Yeah, that's an interesting kind of angle to view it.
It's really a process, and to put it, I've talked a lot about performance management, but to put it more in a category management perspective, when you go in front of the top leaders of your organization and you're going to push for a spend of, let's say, $200 million, this is enormous amount. There's enormous pressure to find the right vendor, to make sure that you have the scope right, that all the terms of the contract are right. There's so many different elements in it, right? And that you can only do it if you have an efficient data processing behind, because you need to have the right data. You have no idea what the management will ask you, but they will ask you, okay, this sub vendor, do we have existing spend with them? How much do we spend for the whole group? And suddenly everyone is panicked. We don't know, right? You cannot know everything, of course, but that's where procurement digitalization takes place. It's in facilitating the access to all kind of data that would answer all kind of questions. When top management sees that you have answer and data-driven answers to these kind of very specific questions, the trust is much stronger. And therefore you get more autonomy in driving your projects.
Yeah, and I always find that an interesting contrast in the sense that you need to be very data-driven. And when you're talking about these overarching processes and the architecture of bringing all of these processes together, obviously you can have differentiation in function within procurement, but that's quite analytical, it's very structured, logical thinking. But then you've got to manage different people. You've got to manage different stakeholders. You've got to manage the C-suite. You've got to manage, buying stakeholders within the organization. You're interacting a lot with finance, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's I always see that as quite an interesting contrast in the skills required to be able to deliver that kind of high performance in procurement.
So one thing that I done with my team, we had team meetings every second week, and I was always bringing topics which are outside of procurement to try to upskill everyone. And for a while, we looked into details about the DISC. Do you know what is a DISC?
The DISC?
It's this psychological test.
Oh, right, okay.
A bit like Myers-Briggs.
Right, okay.
So you have people who are red, who are blue,
yeah.
who are yellow. So analytical, emotional, data, how do you say, goal-oriented. So we went into that and we did role play. I take someone who's empathic and I tell, okay, you're going to play the role of a really angry manager who's red and outcome driven, right? The exact opposite. And then I take someone who's outcome driven and I'm going to ask them to be a soft emotional person. And we do the role play and we analyze how different characters are going against each other. And all the team members say, okay, what do you see in this discussion, in this role play? I think the ability to recognize what type of character you have in front of you and to adapt your speech to this kind of character is very, very powerful in driving positive outcomes. Otherwise, you just drive conflict.
I mean, it's a super high level communication skill, but you know, a lot of people, I'd say most people are capable of it because it's kind of an inherent human quality, but you have to kind of recognize it first, don't you? You might be ignoring it or putting it to the side, or it might be not be something that you're kind of necessarily doing naturally. But I do think that for a lot of people, that's something that they can do it. They just need to recognize it.
I think that once you play this kind of role game, you start to see it everywhere. That was a training that I went through a long time ago, maybe 10 years ago, and I still have it in mind. I remember being in front of my CFO one day, and I'm explaining him the importance of the project, very not emotional, but very engaged in the discussion. And then at some point, I cool down and I think, he's a CFO. He wants figures. I need to throw all the figures I need. And that really helped in the discussion, actually. You have some people you need, instead of going straight to the point, you need to really explain all the detail very carefully, very attentively, and being careful about the emotions. When you do that, you just need to do it once or twice, just for fun. Do it with your wife or whoever, just for fun, and that's going to become a reflex. Actually, you at some point in the discussion, you're going to cool down and you're going to think, okay, who do I have in front of me? How should I adapt my speech, my style?
It's a great skill for everyone, basically, isn't it?
Yeah.
But just another thing I wanted to touch on. It's a bit of a kind of a personal point of interest. You said that you came from did you come from actually, did you do some work in marketing?
Yeah, marketing technologies.
Yes.
I was responsible for the system sending email, basically.
Right. Okay. So when you look at the marketing technology sector, industry, whatever you want to call it, and you look at procurement technology industry, I always find that an interesting comparison, because I feel like the procurement technology stack is growing massively. There's huge innovation and, you know, lots of companies coming into procurement technology, lots of investment going into it, but I feel like it's really early. If you compare it to something like the maturity of marketing technology in terms of just the value of the marketing technology sector, the investments got into it, the massive unicorn giant companies that exist in martech, marketing technology, compared to ProcureTech, it feels like ProcureTech are right at the start of the process compared to marketing technology. Would you agree with that?
Well, the ecosystem in marketing technology is gigantic.
Yeah.
But also because every niche application actually can unlock really high value. Ultimately, you capture market shares with marketing. In procurement technologies, yes, we're early, but I also think that most of the solutions are way too niche. Today, if you look at the spider map from Dr. Louise Epstein, you see hundreds of technologies. If you implement 5, it's already going to cost you millions. So if you implement 10, to maintain the processes, to maintain the knowledge, it's insane, right? So there's a need, I think, of consolidation in the market. We saw initially the best of suite model that was working very well 10 years ago. Then at the same time, IT in most of the MNCs have developed integration platforms. So when integration is not anymore a hurdle, the best of breed model started to be pushed. And today, the recommendation everywhere is go for best of breed, right? But we start to see a reversal, not back to best of suite, but just in the middle. Something which is in between having synergies of a suite, a more integrated model so that you don't have a plethora of very niche solutions, but something that also have some type of expertise. I think where it's becoming the most advanced today is in the CLM market. I think in the CLM market, you get a lot of solutions that provide a lot of niche functionalities, contract mining, obligations management, OCR, close management, even redlining, collaboration. I think these are very well integrated for one specific purpose of the procurement process. In the P2P area, it's pretty much integrated as well. But I think it's all the rest, which is very, very, very niche. If you look at whether it's vendor discovery, risk management, for each and every risk, you have a platform, basically. Supply chain, like your digital twin. There's so many solutions. What do you choose? Where do you make an impact? Ultimately, it boils down to how you drive your strategy internally. But I think there's a lot of room for consolidation in all these niche solutions.
So yeah, it's a bit of a conundrum for the solution providers, because you need to deliver value, but that value needs to be distinct enough to fit into a gap that you have in your existing infrastructure, which naturally drives people towards more niche solutions, because most organizations are going to have a PO process, a procure to pay platform in place, and they're probably going down the route of, if not already in place, with a source to pay solution. And a lot of organizations are struggling to make those S2P solutions work. And maybe they kind of thought it was going to do everything, and that was the pitch. And maybe a bit further down the line, they're realizing that it can't necessarily be all things to all people. It can be very effective, but as the industry develops and as people want more granularity of data in particular areas, there are certain things that we need a more specialized solution. So the kind of best of breed solution providers are trying to create something that is almost like the smallest solution that can deliver the maximum value in their particular area. Because as soon as you start going broader than that, then you're into all sorts of potential conflicts with, like, well, this part of this system crosses over with this part of that system. So it's an interesting conundrum. And I think you're right. I think there will be market consolidation, and that will make it easier. But it's probably quite a similar process. If you mapped it out, it probably happens in most sectors where you're getting this development of the technology in a particular area. Because I don't think there's much uniformity or standardization in the way procurement teams are structured. Operating models is less, there's less overall difference in the basic operating models, but in terms of how their tech stacks are set up, for me, a lot of the time there's so much variation that I don't think it's that easy to just say everybody thinks of the world in these 5 segments or these 20 categories. It's quite a lot of differentiation.
Yeah, so the reason I'm insisting on cognitive load and train my team on that is because when you design a process, this is exactly the same thing. And that's what my team was doing. They were redesigning processes, basically. You need to have in mind the end user. You need to reduce as much as you can the cognitive load when you design this process for the end user. Why? Because then you're not relevant only for experts. You're relevant for the user lambda. And ultimately, satisfaction and adoption comes from easiness of use, comes from minimizing the cognitive load. When you do that, when you deploy a P2P system or a contract system, etc., what is the number one critic that you hear? I don't know how to use the system. I don't know how to do this, how to do that. That's a major issue because the cognitive load is too high, because for the sake of process optimization, a lot of complexity has been added and it's not necessarily easy to remember. I remember we made some analytics on POs and invoices, and we figured out that 80% of the invoices were handled by 20% of the users. That means that the remaining 80% of the users were having a very little amount of PO and invoice in the system. And the average was that they had 2 invoices to approve per year. That means they log into the system every 6 months. They don't remember anything.
Yeah, of course they're not going to. Yeah.
Years ago, the first time they did it right, maybe the second time they did it right, the third time they totally forgot, and that's normal. That's not their job. It's our job to make it easy for them. So really, I was training my team on that, because you always need to have in mind the end user. It's customer centricity. It's exactly the same as in marketing.
I think it applies. So it applies to coding, it applies to process, it applies to decision making very clearly. So that has applications in how tech providers, best of breed tech providers like ourselves, and ProcureTech providers, when you're proposing a solution to an organization, to a procurement buyer, that the cognitive load of what you're putting across has to be absolutely minimized. So it has sales implications as well. It kind of reminds me a little bit of that idea about the confusion of too much choice. If you have a restaurant menu that's got too many items on it, people just don't know what to choose, and they have a bad experience. If you get 3 items, then they can make a choice. But which is another thing that drives it into these quite specific solutions. Because if you've got a solution that's too broad, then people are going to look at it and say, I feel like this is going to run into other things. It's going outside my remit to this stakeholder and this stakeholder over there. It's going to call in these different functions, and it's going to potentially cross over with something we do in this piece of technology here and that piece of technology there. So I think it's critical for solution providers in the industry to be able to conquer that as well. But ultimately, it kind of comes down to what you're talking about, which is the process and understanding the process. And I know that's something that you advocate very strongly for, in terms of when you're looking at your technology stack and you're looking at that best of suite versus best of breed or a hybrid solution. It's about addressing the big problems and starting with the process. And how do you find much resistance to that within teams? Are people kind of like jumping at solutions where they see something shiny? Do you have to kind of bring people back to the process, or do you think it's something that people get straight away?
Well, that depends on the stakeholders. Ultimately, there's one thing that I've seen working very, very well that I learned in IT. It's user-centric design. So when you want to implement a system, so the last one I did like that was a demand management and portfolio management system. I start with the personas. Who is going to use the tool? It's the procurement managers, it's the CPOs, it's top management, and it may be the end user or the functional stakeholder. And for each of them, I start to write a user flow, because they will not do the same thing in the system. So we write the flow in full. I log into the system for what? For consulting reports, for inputting new initiative, for updating initiative, for this, for that. And then, thanks to that, you can build first roles and responsibilities that you configure in the system, a kind of permission table to make sure that they have the experience that they're supposed to have. They see what they're supposed to see. A lot of frustration is, oh, I cannot see my contract, for example, or I cannot see this or that. When you do user-centric design, you minimize this type of problem to start with, and you really talk granular to the person who's supposed to use the system. And I remember that on the launch, this is a system which had the most positive feedback, because finally it was designed for specific people and not for specific functions. What we see in the Big Four implementation of large systems, they have very strong structures, they have very good methodology, but it's not user-centric, it's process-centric. We need to force a process on the users. And that's why you have problems with adoptions. Yes, it's good to optimize processes, but you need to think of the users as well.
Yeah, that's a really great point, because a lot of the time when a problem is addressed, it's addressed with a function in mind, rather than going maybe into a bit more depth to look at the stakeholders within that particular function. But again, that can be quite company specific. So doing that sort of analysis internally is extremely useful. So, I mean, how well do you think most organizations utilize the technology they've already got? Where, bearing in mind, you look out there, there's this extremely complex ecosystem of providers in the kind of best of breed category. Lots of new solutions coming onto the market, new approaches to the solution, to the workflows of procurement. Where does intake happen? How do you utilize AI? All these different factors, the importance of sustainability reporting and things like that. how effectively, what sort of start point are most organizations coming from, in the sense that, do they really have an accurate understanding of what their technology capabilities are first before they look outside?
It really depends, of course. You have top performers. I've seen a few. They are absolutely amazing how they perform in terms of metrics, in terms of engagement, and they don't necessarily have the simplest technology landscape. It can be very convoluted and very complex. But there's one thing I've seen, which is constant across the top performers, is a metrics mindset. It's a performance management culture. Everything is measured. And I remember the first time I came across such organization, we were actually exploring the same solution. So we discussed a bit, and my counterpart said, okay, did you make a list of criteria for evaluation? I said, yes, we have a few questions that we're going to pass the solution for testing to a few users, and then we have a few questions for the users. Then it's like, yes, sure, but how do you evaluate it? I'm like, well, we have the questions and we'll compile the feedback, right? I said, yeah, but this is commentary. What do you do with that? And that's the first time it really struck me. Is that, yeah, it's commentary. It's very subjective. Actually, what I should do is get the commentary. It's very important to have, but score it. Give it score 0 to 5, just a feeling from the person. How user-friendly was it? 0 to 5. How's it? And then you compile the score. You can adjust the weightage and everything. But this is having a metrics mindset, is putting figures everywhere. You don't need to put targets everywhere, but you need to measure everything, because then you understand what are the real bottlenecks, what are the real problems that you need to address, and even what is the size of the problem. Another thing that is a bit controversial is typically when you assess technologies, you have your matrix, which is cost versus impact. And one day we were brainstorming about that, and someone came and told me, hey, remove the cost. We don't need the cost. Of course we need the cost. If we don't have the budget, there's no need to explore it. I said, no. If the problem is big enough, you'll very be likely to put the money for solving it. And he's right. It's all about the problem, all about the size and the impact of the problem. It's not about the cost. The cost is secondary.
Yeah, like you say, it's secondary. It's still an important consideration, but in terms of putting forward a business case, if the need is great enough, the problem is great enough, then inherently there's going to be a large amount of value associated with it, whether it's in an efficiency saving or a cost saving or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and I think on this topic, I would like to dig on one specific thing. You talked a bit about procurement intake a bit earlier. The procurement intake, it's great, but it's all about user experience. It's all about the end user, the Lambda user, not the procurement user. What I would call the amateur purchaser. This is only valid for indirect procurement. They do not purchase direct material. All the direct material is purchased by professional purchasers.
Interesting.
And how do you achieve efficiency through user experience with professional purchasers who know the system because they use it every day? You don't. And suddenly procurement intake is reduced to only indirect. And a lot of the P2P solutions are actually reduced to indirect use cases. And when you put the size of indirect versus the cost of this solution, suddenly the ROI is much lower. So that's a bit what I was telling earlier, that if you start to have so many solutions, that's going to cost you a lot. But each solution is very niche in addressing specific problems. So how do you make it more generic, or how do you consolidate? That's
it's again, it's a conundrum, isn't it? Because in terms of, if you're buying direct materials versus buying indirect, let's say services versus buying goods, it's very different. If you're buying goods, it's a complex supply chain, but it's a simple thing that you're buying. It's fairly binary. It either is that thing, and that weight, that measurement, that number, that quality, or it isn't. Services is completely the opposite, in the sense that it's generally a simple supply chain, but it's an extremely complex thing that you're buying in a lot of cases, hard to define, hard to tie down. I think the other thing you were saying about intake kind of crosses over into the use of AI tools. For example, I know I'll come on to it in a bit. I know you're doing some interesting stuff with ChatGPT as well, but we've done some stuff around scoping for services requirements, statements of work type scope creation, that sort of thing. Very effective to do that. But you also have to consider that when you're going through that process, some people know what they're going to buy. And some people don't necessarily need to be led through a process and guided quite so much. They know what they want. But that's easy to take into account as long as you do take it into account. And like you say, some of the kind of intake approaches are based on the approach of assuming that the person doesn't really know anything about what it is they want to buy from the start of it. So I think that will evolve over time, that there has to be slightly different pathways through the process, depending on the level of expertise, where you can kind of go, I need to skip this bit. I need to just get to where I need to get to. And I think that's something that we've seen in practice, where we're dealing with the procurement of services, complex services, typically in our use of our system with live customers, we've had to really build that into it in all parts of the process, in the sense that an educated buyer who's done this lots of times, like you say, the kind of the 20% of people that do 80% of the POs, they just need to go through quickly. They know what they need to do. They know how they need to do it. So you need to have the right pathways. And again, it comes back to user experience, user-centric design. So I think that's a really good point. And it's something that I don't think a lot of people have picked up on yet. So I think that's quite an interesting angle on it.
Most of the vendors, they try to sell you as many licenses as possible. So they will tell you, this is for everyone. Procurement should be for everyone. All the organization, you have 10,000 employees, 10,000 license, easy, right? But actually, it is wrong. There was the other extreme. You only buy 300 license, which are only your professional purchasers. Then they will become a bottleneck to the organization. So there's a model in between, which is a semi-professionalization of procurement, where you have procurement champions in each and every department. And these guys are doing the purchase for their department. They have more familiarity with the system, with the process. They have a better contact with the procurement transactional team or whatever, or tactical team. But at the same time, that helps the core procurement team by giving additional capacity in terms of manpower.
So one of the things you just touched on there was licenses. I'm kind of going off on a bit of a tangent here, but I'm just interested to see what your opinion is. Do you think that the user license model is still, I'd say that's still a prevalent model in procurement technology. But if you look at, for example, the user license model versus spend-based models, how do you see that? What's most relevant, and how do you see that potentially changing moving forward?
I think today there's an equal amount of revenue-based model versus license-based. What's important is to have flexibility. You always have a base license, access to the platform, right? And then after that, you can have a revenue share or whatever. Some organizations are ready to put a lot of money up front and are very risk averse when it comes to revenue sharing. Some of the companies, they don't have high budget, but they want efficiency. So if they can have it cheaper as a barrier of entry and pay a little bit more in revenue sharing, so some companies would do that. So I think you can have whatever model. If you have a bit of flexibility around it, that's going to broaden your customer base.
Yeah, I agree. I think flexibility is required, and that's where, when you get best of breed platforms coming through and newer entrants into the market that are more disruptive, they're typically going to be more agile and more flexible than the big incumbent platforms that have been around for a long period of time. And by the very nature of their success and by the very fact that they've done a great job, they end up being quite inflexible as platforms because they've got so many big customers, so much legacy, the tech's been around for a while. So I think that's going to be interesting to see how that kind of predictions for transitions and trends in that area comes across. But one of the, so firstly, when you're looking at those costing models, there's the element internally of, well, I need to plan this. I need to plan out those costs. So if you're leveraging a revenue share, for example, then you know that you're going to be happy with the outcome in theory. But there's also just that kind of budget planning. What are we going to be spending on X? What are we going to be spending on Y? So there's a bit of a kind of contrast there. which is a little bit like with the benefits of using procurement technology and going through a digital transformation. I always see it as you've got these kind of hard savings versus soft savings. And if you look at an area of complexity, like if you take a complex services category, like, I don't know, consultancy, you might be able to see the hard cost saving of how much money you've saved against budget of what's contracted with the supplier for a consulting project, for example. But in terms of so there you've got your kind of hard saving of we've saved X against budget in the procurement of this service. In the delivery of that service, all sorts of things might happen. It might overrun, things might change. It's just the inherent nature of, for example, consulting. So measuring the actual return on investment, the value you got from that project is so much harder that I feel like to a certain extent that can be beyond some organizations' capabilities at the moment. They're so far further back down the track that if procurement are likely to be targeted on the hard savings in a lot of cases, the soft savings and these other things, these more intangible savings around efficiency and around using the best suppliers in the future and all those sorts of things, that's surely where it's got to move to. But I still wonder how many companies right now can buy based on those softer, more intangible savings.
Yeah, I think we should really stop to measure procurement on hard savings only.
Yeah.
Of course, it's important, but let's say that the average saving in a procurement function is about 12%. When you're in an inflationary context of 7%, then suddenly you're just saving actual 5%. That's it. And if your CFO have put a target at 10%, how do you achieve that? You need to do 17% to achieve that. That's ridiculous. However, cost avoidance, very important. Obligation management. There's a lot of values that can be unlocked through obligation management. I've seen mature organizations there bringing millions and millions by efficiently spotting contract deficiencies in terms of obligation and claiming back the money, basically. Like you said, in the services as well, services shouldn't be difficult to track, but because historically there has been a very bad visibility of the spend and of the life cycle of the spend, not only the signature of the contract, but how it evolves. Because of this lack of visibility, there's so much deviation and non-compliance issues. You see guys on the consultancy contract for 5-7 years. Yeah. These guys should have been replaced by the FTE, right? It doesn't make any sense. And there's a lot of room for deviant behaviors as well, right? I wouldn't say corruption, but there's these kind of things in the service industry as well. It's just about visibility, it's spend analytics. But across life cycle of different type of spend, it can become pretty complex. I think there's a lot of value to unlock there in obligation management in general, on top of hard savings and cost avoidance. It can be as simple as we have product A, which costs 100 today. There's a huge supply chain issue for this specific product because there's only one chip manufacturer for one component there. And therefore, we will not buy it for 100, we will not buy it for 90, we will buy it for 150, plus 50%. But guess what? Actually, the worst vendor was offering us at 200. So we actually, our baseline was 200 and we went down to 150. It's not going to show like that on the savings, but this is a reality that category managers are facing every day. Right. They see price increase and basically they need to manage the price increase and to less impact their P&L, go for the one who increase the less.
Yeah, it's the devil's in the detail, isn't it? And I sometimes feel that if you separate pre-contract and post-contract, the ability to measure savings at the point of contract, most people have, that's within the realms of capability of most relatively developed procurement functions. As soon as you go past that, it's very difficult. It's just more complicated, but also it falls down if you're not capturing the detail that happens post-contract. But also, whose responsibility is it post-contract? You know, in a lot of organizations, where does that responsibility lie? You know, is that the procurement team's fault? Is that the buyer? In some cases, it might be the supplier. It falls into that kind of slightly more slightly grayer area. How do you kind of see that sort of thing playing out? I feel like it's something that still needs to be resolved in most organizations. It's a progression from where we are now.
Yeah. You know, we have extremely complex policies and manual in most of the companies. Enforcing the compliance across these policies is close to impossible. The more data you capture, the more advanced model you have, the more you can be compliant, of course, because you detect a non-compliance. I don't really have a solution yet. I think you're right. This is an area where there's a lot of potential to think through it. But I think there's so much more pressing areas right now in terms of inflation, supply chain disruption, that it's probably a bit behind in terms of priorities. The basic compliance is more or less okay in most of the companies. Risk-based approach starts to be implemented to bring efficiency to the compliance process. So yeah, I mean, I cannot deny that it's important, but is it really the top priority? I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, as I say, I feel like it's an evolution. There are problems that need to be solved prior to that. So let's go back a step, and just one of the things we were talking about earlier was obviously you've gone from being in-house to now working on the consultancy side. When you're going into organizations now, what usually are the kind of most pressing issues that you're having to look at for those organizations that you're working with?
I think best practice. Everyone is looking for best practice. How do you do this process the best? Because even if there's communities, there's a lack of communication. The big fours are typically, I wouldn't say not knowing, they know, but that depends whose partner you get in, right?
Absolutely.
If you get a partner which is focused on digital transformation, he's probably not as savvy as a one who's focused on procurement. And there you can skip implementation of best practices and you just implement what's common sense, and you just implement what's recommended by the vendors, which is not necessarily the best practice, by the way. Ultimately, it really boils down to what exposure do you have? Do you talk to a lot of people? Do you see what works? Do you see what doesn't work? I think when I made the transition, I understood one thing very, very quickly, is that when you're in the industry, unless you're in top general management, you are in a very, very niche area. You're a specialist. And very quickly, when you transition to consultancy, you need to broaden your scope very, very quickly. You need to read a lot. You need to look at a lot of videos, podcasts, because you're too niche. You're going to have plenty of questions that go beyond what was your scope previously in the industry. People want not to know what your scope was and how did you handle it, but what your whole procurement function was doing. And how this was implemented, how do you do this, how you do that. Of course, you don't reveal secrets because some things are confidential. But what you can see is, okay, these are the best practice, recommended practice, and you visualize, you apply common sense, and you bring that on the table. So yeah, I'd say the question number one is best practices. The question number two is change management. How do you actually implement these best practices? How do you handle different type of stakeholders, especially the resistant one? I wouldn't say the finance people, but they will recognize themselves. Change management.
I'm sure they would agree.
Yeah, they would. No, but I mean, it's a different culture, right? I'm going to go back to something else. To when I was in marketing technology, we had a huge reorganization driven by one of the big four and a very pioneer program. We were implementing agile methodology in IT. So in IT, they had pilot teams, they had very clear structure, very clear roles and responsibilities. They spent 1 year really crafting a good plan. What are the different escalation channels, etc., etc. They implemented it. It went like a breeze. People were happy, more productive. The change was very well managed. And then they did the same thing in marketing. Marketing is a different kind of people. In IT, people are very detailed, very process-oriented, because when you code, if you don't code the right thing, it doesn't matter. The computer will not run. In marketing, if you make a mistake on one word, it doesn't really matter. It's okay, right? And it's a more creative world.
Yeah.
So when they implemented the first agile teams in marketing, the pilot worked very, very well. And I remember we were on this big room planning. They announced the reorg for marketing, and I see the structure. I'm like, but okay, you have the teams, you have the methodology, but how do you create the alignment between the teams? What are the top level channels to create the alignment? So I raised my hand, and the answer was like, oh, we have not figured out all the details yet. This will come in the coming weeks. And of course, it was a disaster because it's all about alignment. But that's why, because it's a different mindset, and that's not been taken into account by the people implementing the methodology. In IT, people are very detailed. In marketing, they're very creative.
Yeah.
So, of course, you don't have the same output. And I think it's the same in procurement versus finance. Procurement has very different goals and objectives than finance. They have much less compliance issues. They have more negotiation issues, which is a more creative activity. So expecting to bring the same framework to finance people than you do in procurement when you implement P2P, for example, that's not going to work. You need to adapt your speech. Once again, it's like the colors we talked about before. You need to adapt your speech. Your finance don't care about ESG. Let's be very clear about it. What they care is working capital. It's completeness of accounting. Beyond that, they don't want to hear about it. So then you need to have basically a dual business case. You need to have a business case which shows AP efficiency, which shows increase in working capital through, let's say, supply chain finance onboarding, which shows better visibility on your spend, on the process itself. That means better completeness of accounting, better accrual reconciliation. When you build your business case like that, your finance is on board. If you build it saying that thanks to the system, we're going to generate 20 million savings more, they couldn't care less. We're going to achieve our ESG targets? They don't care. That's not touching them directly. So it's really, how do you adapt your speech to different type of people? That's a bit how I advise in terms of change management. So yeah, question number two, best practice. Number one, best practice. Number two, change management. And beyond that, it's the classic. How do you implement the system? What technology selection?
Yeah, I think when you're talking about best practice and you're talking about kind of where the industry is and where most companies are, I think one of the points that comes across in talking to you is that what doesn't work needs talking about just as much as what does work. So for example, your example in that scenario with the marketing function, this is where I feel like this sort of conversation with people like yourself, this is the type of conversation that needs to happen in the industry as much as possible. And I think procurement people are actually generally pretty good at talking about the stuff that didn't go right, rather than just saying, oh, I've got all the answers and we did this and we did that and it was perfect, because it pretty much never is. It's too young as a function for it to be perfect, and it's too varied, because every organization has different demands, different setup, different culture. But I think that's quite a powerful thing in terms of what's the most useful conversation in the market to advance the procurement profession. It's understanding what the options are, what the pitfalls, what other people are finding when they're trying to do it, just sharing information. Yeah.
But ultimately, when you want to have this discussion, what went wrong or what is wrong, you need to have the data.
Yeah.
There's one topic recently I have with everyone I talk with. It's, you have a procurement process. from analyzing the demand to implementing the contract. You have different stages, right? I've not found a single organization in the past weeks which measures the cycle time between each of these steps. They have no idea where the bottleneck is. They have an idea because they know the process by use. But they don't have actionable insights telling them this is exactly there. That is it the redlining? Is it issuing the RFP? Where is your bottleneck? And no one knows. I think the metrics are very well developed for transactional procurement, but when it comes to tactical procurement and strategic procurement, there's very little metrics available in organizations today. And I think a lot of new solutions are actually around that, around bringing you more data about your RFPs, around your category management. That's where there's also a lot of potential to improve the process.
Yeah. So another question for you in terms of that switch from being an in-house procurement practitioner to working on the consulting side. How do you find, what are the differences in terms of how you were interacting with the different teams within an organization? Is that something that's changed at all, or is it very much the same?
Yeah, very different. Very different because here I don't have, how to say, the upper hand. I'm here to offer a service. So I need to be customer centric. My priority is doing what the customer needs, doing what's best for the customer. That leads to value creation. And that means that I'm mostly in very, very positive interactions. The only negative is me with myself, as when I'm pushing myself to do better for them. But it's mostly positive interaction. How can I help? How can I support you? Okay, this is a plan. This is how we will unlock value, and hopefully this is what we deliver, right? When you're in the industry, this is slightly the opposite. You're measured, you have targets, very often too ambitious targets. So you're going to fail, or you're going to have problems here, problem there. Talk to any top managers. They will tell you that their job is not really to be a procurement expert or a finance expert or whatever. It's to put down fires. You constantly receive escalations, you manage the escalations. This is mostly negative interactions, which are not about unlocking value, about creating value, but about avoiding impact, avoiding damage, and preserving value. So it's a very different type of interaction. Also, you have to handle operations. When you're in consultancy, you typically don't handle the operations. But when you do, that's where also the negative interaction comes, because it's never satisfactory. And of course, otherwise there would be no room for improvement. But I think that's what changed a lot. I went to very, very, very positive discussions.
Interesting. Okay, so just a kind of potentially quite a big topic, but let's just kind of touch on it fairly briefly and kind of wrap things up around this. AI in procurement. So you and I have both done some work in this area. What is it that actually got you interested in it? I've got an inkling, because obviously you come from a kind of coding background, but what is it you find interesting about it, and how do you think that procurement can most effectively take advantage of the AI opportunities that are now starting to crop up and be available?
Yeah, so since I'm in programming since a long time, I've always followed the kind of progress in AI. I implemented AI solutions already 10 years ago. It was a clustering algorithm for court decisions. At that time, there was no search engine for court decisions that was very valuable for lawyers. And then different solution came. And when I moved to marketing technology, I remember there was a vendor which had a AI solution to send smarter emails to your prospects. And when I asked what was under the hood, because I'm very interested in the technology, it was extremely basic. It was an algorithm from 20 years ago. Really? That's what they sell?
That's not really AI, is it? And I think that's where it must have been an interesting conversation where you were kind of asking the pointed questions. Must have been quite awkward for the people on the other end.
So typically they don't know. They have no idea. When you ask too much details, the product managers, they don't know. But forget it. I think there's a lot of hype. There's a lot of disillusionment. So that's the typical curve, hype cycle from Gartner, right? The reason there's disillusionment is that people don't really understand what it is about. Even today, ChatGPT, people don't understand what it does. They think that ChatGPT thinks, reason. It doesn't. What ChatGPT is, it's a completion prompt. It basically takes your question as a sentence and predict what is the next word to put as an answer. That's what it does, nothing more. It's not statistical, it's smarter than that. But that's what it does. And when you do prompt engineering, you keep that in mind, because ultimately you want to write a question in the form of a text that feels natural for ChatGPT to then complement after your prompt.
Do you think that a lot of people? I feel like this when I've seen people playing around with like the ChatGPT playground. I feel like a lot of people almost try to talk to it in the same way that they talk to Google at the moment.
Yeah, that's what they try. And the limitation is a cutover. The cutover was September 21. After that, it doesn't know anything anymore. So right now, there's a lot of solutions, including solutions that I'm developing myself, which are about augmenting ChatGPT with actual data from today, whether it's data which is internal, external, or a mix of it. But without trying to pitch my product, I'm going to talk about Bing Chat. When you go to Bing Chat and you type your question, what does it do? It doesn't query ChatGPT first. It's first doing a search through Bing. The top 3 articles are returned. These 3 articles are then fed as a context in a prompt to ChatGPT, and ChatGPT will basically use this context to write the answer. And that's it. That's how they augment it with actual data from today. But then when you think like that, the use cases are enormous, because that means that it's all about the context that you feed inside the prompt behind the curtain.
100%. Yeah, totally agree.
And the possibilities are endless in this context. You can retrieve data from a database. You can retrieve internal documentation. What we see today also is the more the models advance and compute becomes cheap, the more the context window can be big. So until last week, you could put 4,000 tokens as a context to ChatGPT 3.5. Today, they released a new version. You can go up to 8,000. That means instead of putting 40 pages of document, you can put 80 pages of document as a context. And ChatGPT will base its answer on this amount of facts. And that is going to really augment the capability to drive information, relevance of information given by ChatGPT. ChatGPT is good at 2 things. One, which is completion. That's what we talked about. If you enrich it with context, you have a very good use case. The second one is summarization.
Yeah.
When you give a lot of information, and especially with the context windows going bigger and bigger, you can give more and more information and summarize it in a more efficient way. Where can this apply in procurement? Reporting. You can get a lot of feedback, which is conversational from many stakeholders, and summarize it in just one click. And we know how reporting is a big problem in procurement. Typically, you have 1 resource per team dedicated to reporting. So that's one use case. Planning. When you're doing your supply chain planning, it's also a lot of data that you need to crunch and summarize. With a combination of rules and prompt engineering, you can make the planning process more efficient. I remember when GitHub Copilot was released, I think it was a year or a year and a half ago. Very quickly, people started to imagine what are the use cases. Will the programmers become useless, right? Today, they have not lost their jobs. They're just more efficient. Instead, you have a transition from doing the job to reviewing the job. today, if you're a programmer, you're going to get a piece of code from Copilot or from ChatGPT, paste it, review it to make sure that it didn't hallucinate. In procurement, you can do the same. You can feed it with information, ask it to do a kind of market research, and then you just need to review the output to make sure that this is proper. So we're going to transform our work into a lot of review. I'd say that basically the balance between work and review is going to be reversed, but that doesn't mean that we're going to be replaced or whatever. We're going to be more efficient, and we're going to be the judges of the quality of the work done by the machine.
Yeah, absolutely. It elevates the cognitive process required. It's a more strategic approach rather than doing the kind of basic work. So one of the things you talked about was the fact of the type of data that these large language models are actually using. So, for example, Bing Chat is using up-to-date information, but it's using that specific set of information. You can obviously provide a lot more data. And I know the tool that you have is looking at internal documents and data, isn't it? One of the things I find quite interesting about the kind of changes in how OpenAI and ChatGPT work is the fact that they now have this relationship with Microsoft in terms of like data security. It's quite interesting in terms of the policies about how they separate themselves in the sense that, you know, the data that's provided is walled off from being used to develop the model effectively. So it can be used to provide, it can be used as context for ChatGPT to provide an answer. So taking that into context, looking at the data that ChatGPT is using is quite interesting. So, for example, Bing Chat is using up-to-date data that the search engine is providing. It's doing an analysis on that and doing a very effective summarization of the information that's been provided for you. You don't have to search through all the different pages. It's just giving you the answer that you're looking for. So that's a really interesting use case. What you also talked about was the fact of it being able to use external data and much larger amounts of external data. Now, as I understand it, what you're doing with your product, Help GPT, is actually looking at internal data and documentation. And one of the things that I just wanted to briefly touch on was the increase in data security that has happened with OpenAI and ChatGPT since the partnership with Microsoft, where it's effectively, as I understand it, now you're really at a point where you can trust, you know, if people are worried about trusting using ChatGPT, then they should be worried about using Outlook and Teams and all these other things that are all part of the same Microsoft setup. I think that's quite a game changer in the way that that's been moved. I mean, ultimately, as I understand it, the information that's provided is not going to be used to train the model. It's just used for that specific response. Do you have any particular opinions on that? I think it's a bit of a game changer.
Yeah, I think people have been very quick at trying to justify the fear of adopting quickly a technology by the data security issue. I was actually at the OpenAI tour in Singapore, where Sam Altman was there and was repeating that they do not use the data for fine-tuning. They do not use it for retraining the model. Not at all. And he said we were actually pretty bad at explaining that, actually. But then beyond that, you have Microsoft, which is capitalizing on their investment. So they opened the Azure OpenAI service in their Azure cloud services. And they give even additional guarantees. Now the models are deployed within Azure ecosystem and infrastructure. They have guarantees by contract that there is no use for retraining, no use for fine-tuning, that the only use of the data is for debugging process. And you can actually ask to opt out from it. So they give a set of guarantees that, to me, look good. Exactly like, as you say, otherwise you would stop using Outlook, you would stop using the analytics from Office 365, et cetera, et cetera. However, even today, you have some industries which are extremely regulated, banking, gambling, et cetera, et cetera. And these companies typically have their own data center. They do not have a cloud policy. They want to have everything on premise. For the use case of internal data, what you use is only the ability to rephrase a context.
Okay.
That means that you don't need GPT-4 to do that. You could you need GPT-4. Just to do completion with a very strong context, you don't need very advanced model. You can actually do with GPT-2. And these models can be deployed on premise. You have much more advanced than GPT-2. You have, for example, Dolly from Databricks. You have plenty of models now with commercial licenses that can be deployed on premise. So I think the fear is more because people didn't do their homework, didn't have the time or whatever. But I think the data security and data privacy aspect is fully covered today.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you explain that. You explain that very well. Our CTO is very good at explaining it because he's a technical person. I'm not quite so good at explaining it, but I definitely think there's it's one of the first questions that large organizations ask if you're showing them something you've done, like the scoping tool that we've built using ChatGPT. So let's wrap things up there. I really enjoyed that conversation. It's great to get your views on this stuff and to hear also the way that you apply it to real experiences. I think that's really useful for me and hopefully useful for other people as well. Do you have any kind of what are your kind of predictions? Obviously, we're in an interesting time where there's lots of supply chain disruption, inflationary pressures. What are your predictions for how the kind of big challenges that procurement are going to have to deal with over the next kind of 12 to 18 months?
Well, who would have predicted COVID?
Yeah.
Who would have predicted the supply chain disruption, the war in Ukraine? No one, right? And people like prediction. People like to have predictive models for their supply chain and everything. But as soon as a real disruption is coming that no one saw coming, then these models are totally useless. So I think it's not about predictions, it's about capabilities. If you have the capabilities to give you the data when you need it, if you have a flexible process, if you have the right structure, you can be very agile in handling disruptions. Ultimately, what you try to increase in any organization is the velocity at which you deliver innovation, at which you get insight for everything. So the more data you get, the more you have built a system which allows you to answer any question. This is what's really going to make you future-proof to any disruption. I'm not an oracle. I'm not going to predict anything.
But just to go back to what you were saying, so what you're effectively saying is the most important thing that procurement organizations can do right now is build the capability to be able to answer any questions that might come up in the future and to be able to deal with the unpredictable nature of the market conditions that we deal with now, and ultimately to have flexibility.
Yeah, so I'm going to give an example. When the inflation started to kick in, a lot of organizations were unable to track this inflation. I've seen one organization coming out with a report of 80 pages, category by category, with the curve showing the impact of inflation and adapting their category strategy based on these findings. And this was done very, very quickly. The ability to output this kind of reports is really going to give you an edge in adapting your strategy. So the faster you are at giving insights to management, basically, the faster you can pivot in your strategy.
Excellent stuff. Well, listen, thank you so much for taking the time to chat, Vince. I really enjoyed it. I think there's a lot more we could talk about, and maybe we'll have to have a follow-up session at some time. But really appreciate you taking the time, putting some of your thoughts across, giving some of the benefit of some of the experiences that you've had, sharing that information. It's really useful and very much appreciated. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Johnny. A real pleasure for me as well.
Excellent.